And with that, we're gonna move on to Columbia County. And I'll put it to who to talk about these estimates really quickly.
Okay, so again, same situation here in Columbia County as Clackamas County. The population growth mainly is because of net migration. Also, natural change is decreasing, number of deaths exceed number of births. So here, also as the most recent version of the estimates 23, we went also back and revised the 22 and 21 estimates. That's why you may see difference because of we receive more data for those previous years. As you can see here, there is a drop in the population of the Columbia County between 20 and 21, and this also because the net migration was decreasing as well during or between those 2 years. But again, all, there is an increasing in the population of Columbia County between the 2020 census and July 1st from 52,000 K to 53 K as of July 1st, 23.
Yeah. And looking at the forecast here, again, this is a location in Columbia where we're seeing greater growth, a little bit higher than expected in the near term, outpacing what we had last time. But again, in the long term, to decrease over time. And again, a couple of reasons why is that by 2020, we saw this big shift within Columbia County where deaths really outpaced births. Within the county, and that was sped up by COVID, definitely. But again, a pattern that we expect to see moving forward from both sides and in terms of the natural change. So again, a location where we're pretty optimistic in terms of the net migrants coming into the county. I think that if you compare our projections on the right of that dotted line to what happened in the past on the left, that's pretty high relative to the 5-year averages that we've seen before. But again, looking at the changes really come from that natural change. And where we expect births to continue to decline over time, and deaths to increase over time. And you saw in that birth count that it's really dropping off over time. Columbia has had a historically higher than average than the rest of the state, in terms of fertility rate. But we expect that gap to close over time as people are having less kids within the county as well. We've seen this really speed up again, this process of even counties that had higher than average fertility rates before the pandemic. This brought their fertility rates down very quickly, and people are just having less kids in the aftermath and not again bouncing back to those those high levels before. Life expectancy dropped off during the pandemic, but we think that is going to recover a bit and then eventually increase to higher than what it was before the pandemic as well. Aging within the population, again, you see this really young age population on the left in 1990, and that's shifting to a more even distribution by 2020. As we move forward, the age of the population is going to get really top heavy in terms of an older population outnumbering younger population to some degree. Right. And again, population growth here shown by race ethnicity. Over the past, 30 years, we saw a really big increase in the Hispanic population, and we expect that to continue, not to the same degree, but also Hispanic population growth to be really contributing in this area. Going through the UGVs, Clatskanie, again, an area where there's a big difference between the city boundaries and the UGV boundaries here. Population decline in Clatskanie happened between 2010 and 2020, where the population now sits at about 1,700. And housing units also declining during that same period. Occupancy rate a little bit lower than the county or the state averages in this point, and an employment rate that's a little bit lower as well in the area, and an age 65 plus that is just ever so slightly higher than the rest of the state. Again, population growth saw a jump between 2000 and 2010, but then slowed down in 2020. And we expect modest increases in the population over the next 30 years or so, and for it to stabilize to about 2,100 people moving forward. So this is a little bit different than what we expected last time. We are seeing more people come in post-COVID in Clatskanie. than we expected. And so you see that big jump between 2020 and 2030, but then for the growth pattern to be a little bit more modest moving forward. So you see it higher in the more recent terms than the last time we made this forecast, but then lower as we move forward. And again, growth rate comparisons here, that like lime green is Clatskanie, and you see it's lower than average than the county and lower than the region. And we expect that for most of the years moving forward. Columbia City, here's an area again, the city boundary versus the UGB boundary. So we have a little bit of UGB portions that are up here and below here that are not counted within the city area. Slight differences there. Slight population growth, ever so slightly 0.15%. And again, that's over a 10-year period. So minimal change in population, minimal change in housing over time. Less persons per household than we see in the county overall. And the region overall. Employment rate that is very high though. But an age 65 plus that is also very high in the population as well. And that's going to affect our population forecast as well. So again, given that we have a bit older population here, we're expecting slower increases in the total population over time for the UGB area. Still no declines, but very modest in terms of the population growth. Again, comparison here. This is kind of the case for a lot of Columbia, although not all of it. Prescott here, differences between UGB and city are very minimal. A small population here that we're dealing with, so I'm just going to run through this relatively quickly. For the population growth, sitting at 80 currently and forecasted to be about 100 as we move forward and stabilize like around there over time. And again, please stop me if I'm running this too fast or if there's a particular one. And I will make comments for the survey responses or the housing responses that I have if I received one for the location, but if not, I might run through these a little bit quickly and try and make up some time. For Rainier, differences between the city and the UGB boundary over here. A population of about 1,900, and a slight increase from before, high employment rate, lower household income rate than the rest of the region in terms of that. So again, slow population growth moving over time, but as the population continues to age, this declines in the long term. Okay, this one I know is one that we want to talk about. Scappoose over here, looking at the differences between the city boundaries and the UGB boundaries, highlighted here. So there is a bit of differences here that we want to account for. Larger population than the UGBs that we've been talking about before, and a larger increase, right? 21% increase. That's very different than the other UGBs and the county averages. That we've been seeing, a little bit lower persons per household, but again, high household income over here and relatively younger age population and big population growth here, pretty different than the rest of the county. And so we see that moving forward as well in terms of population growth. Like all locations, you know, we're toning it down a bit from the last time that we've made these forecasts. But again, Scappoose is an outlier in terms of the growth rate that we're expecting to see. Not just within the county, it's historically been higher than the county, but we also expect to see it higher than the region as a whole, expected to outpace growth in other areas as it looks, as growth looks more similar to some of the UGBs in other areas rather than in the Columbia County region. I did note here that housing growth that is contingent on a resolution of a David Weekley's home project, that 44 new housing units are expected to come to this area, but it's contingent on that passing, and that there's a number of housing units that are under review that could be completed in the next 2 years, influencing this. So we've included the David Weekley Homes project in terms of our expectation, but not the current housing numbers that are under review, just for complete transparency in terms of like what our expectations are for Scappoose and the projections for the region. And this is a slight upwards adjustment from what we had in November, marginally so from the last time as well, even though it's a downward from 2020. Again, these impacts from lower fertility rates in the area. St. Helens, another one, where we received some feedback in talking about, housing construction in the area. Again, city differences compared to the UGB, modest increase of the population of about 7% and housing increase by about 9%. A high employment rate in the area and a household income of about 77,000, which I believe is above the county average for this area, and a younger than average population. Population increase in the UGB by about 6%, again, pretty modest there. But an increase nonetheless, and we expect this population increase again to be larger in the short term. So this is one where we've upwardly adjusted because of the new builds that are happening recently. But then again, for that population increase to slow down over time, we expect a big jump in near term, slower growth in long term moving forward. So on par with the 10-year forecast from last time, but slower than expected in the long term for St. Helens. A couple of comments that I want to also hear is that there are current upgrades being worked on the sewer system, and that there were closures to majors employers in Armstrong World and Armstrong World in there, and I can't read my notes. Cascade Tissue, I think, is the other one in there. But 439 new housing units were brought on in the past 3 years in the area, leading to part of this jump in the increase in the next 10 years. Vernonia, which I believe is the last in Columbia, population increased by about 10%, which is a good amount. High occupancy rates, household income of about 78,000 and younger than average population. Some fluctuations in the population change over time, big increase by 1990, decline, but then increase again. So you see that reflected into a more modest growth, like moving forward here again, bigger jump as we expect some of these new housing units to influence it in the next 10 years, but then more modest increases and eventual decline by 2070 in the population.